The air was still, not the stillness of peace, but the kind that settles after everything that once mattered has already died. A breeze brushed across the abandoned rooftops of Z City, stirring the dust of collapsed towers and the ghosts of forgotten battles. The sun hung dim behind the haze, no longer golden, but pale and disinterested, like the expression of the man who stood beneath it. Saitama leaned against the edge of a ruined skyscraper, his yellow suit faded, his gloves worn thin. The wind tugged at his cape, but he didn't bother to fix it. He hadn't bothered with much lately. Somewhere far below, the world continued its mechanical rhythm, sirens, trains, and people pretending to be alive. But for him, there was only silence. He had not fought a real battle in years, not since the last monster, whatever its name, had been felled to a single punch like all the others. It didn't scream, it didn't curse. It simply vanished, as if erasing itself from existence had been an act of mercy. That was the moment he realized something fundamental. There was no thrill left in creation. He had reached the end of his journey, not by death, but by completion. When every wall had been broken and every enemy rendered meaningless, what was left for a man whose only joy came from struggle? Saitama could not die, but he also could not live. He exhaled, slow and indifferent, eyes tracing the fractured skyline. Sometimes he wondered if the universe itself was mocking him, this endless repetition, this farce of existence. Every sunrise identical to the last, every nightfall another curtain drop in a performance that no longer needed an audience. "Guess it's just me again," he muttered, voice flat. A plastic bag fluttered past, snagging against a metal rod before drifting away. Even that seemed to have more purpose than he did. There had been times, distant, flickering times, when Saitama thought perhaps he could find meaning elsewhere. He tried to be a teacher, a mentor, a grocery shopper who cared about sale days again. But the spark always faded. No one could match him. Nothing could challenge him. Not villains, not gods, not the very laws of physics. He was the absolute. And in that absolute, there was nothing but void. He closed his eyes. In that blackness, there were faint echoes, faces of people who once filled his days. Genos, King, Fubuki, even the mosquito that had once mocked his limits. But they, too, were gone now. Some had aged, others had vanished. He had stopped keeping track long ago. Time, for him, was a flat circle, every second a mirror of the last. "Maybe," he whispered, "it's time I go somewhere else." The thought came uninvited, a strange vibration in his mind, like a memory that didn't belong to him. Somewhere beyond his perception, reality seemed to twist, as if reacting to the weight of his boredom. The sky trembled. At first, he ignored it. Probably another dimensional rift, another bored deity trying to summon a champion. It had happened before. They always ended the same way. A punch, a crater, silence. But this felt different. The air carried a static hum, a low frequency that didn't touch the ears but clawed directly at the soul. Even Saitama, who had stopped feeling fear long ago, felt curious. The clouds folded inward, spiraling around an unseen point. Lightning crackled, not blue but crimson, painting the heavens in unnatural light. The sky opened not like a storm, but like a wound. He stepped forward. The city around him distorted, colors bleeding into each other as gravity itself began to misbehave. His reflection flickered across shards of glass floating mid-air. For the first time in countless years, he didn't know what was happening, and that made his heart beat just once, faintly. A whisper echoed, not in sound but in thought. "Do you seek purpose, mortal?" He blinked. "Huh? Who's there?" The voice didn't answer. It multiplied. It laughed. It wept. Reality convulsed. The ground beneath him ruptured, splitting like fabric. From the fracture spilled not magma, but darkness, a living, writhing dark that devoured light itself. The buildings bent toward it, pulled like offerings into an unseen throat. The sky was gone now, replaced by an endless void that pulsed like the heartbeat of a dying god. The air screamed, and Saitama smiled. For the first time in eons, something felt new. He stood still as the world collapsed around him. The wind tore at his suit, glass cut across his cheek, and still he smiled. "I was just wondering," he said softly, "if somewhere out there, there's still a fight worth having." The darkness reached for him, tendrils of pure entropy winding around his legs, his arms, his chest. He didn't resist. It was not a fall through space. It was a fall through meaning, through the collective nightmares of existence itself. He passed through visions, wars of metal gods, screams of planets being devoured, prayers muttered in despair to an emperor who never answered. He saw machines that lived longer than civilizations, men who died believing in lies, angels with broken wings carrying torches through oceans of corpses. Everywhere he looked, there was death, but not the simple kind he was used to, the kind that comes and goes. This was death as a law, a fabric that held the cosmos together. Somewhere deep within, Saitama felt something stir, a feeling he had forgotten long ago. It was not fear. It was not excitement. It was awe. The voice returned, fragmented now, layered with countless tongues. "You do not belong here, yet you were called. A being beyond balance, drawn by the hunger of the warp. Even gods tremble when the void whispers your name." Saitama couldn't make sense of it. The words slipped through his mind like water, leaving only confusion behind. Then came the pain. A billion memories, none of them his, flooded his consciousness. Crusades of iron, worlds burning in the name of faith, titans made of flesh and circuitry, screaming hymns to false salvation. He saw them all, felt them all. The warp was showing him its truth, the truth of a universe that had long forgotten mercy. And yet, somewhere in that chaos, he heard laughter. Not the cruel kind, not the mocking kind, but a laughter that sounded familiar. It was his own. Light burst through his vision. He felt himself tearing through the last layer of the void, crashing into something solid. Dust, stone, the smell of ozone and blood. He opened his eyes. The sky was no longer the dull grey of Earth, but a turbulent storm of ash and fire. Monolithic cathedrals loomed across the horizon, built not for beauty but for obedience. Chants echoed harsh, mechanical voices praising a name he didn't know. And then, he saw them. Humans, or something close, clad in armor, faces hidden behind masks of devotion and fear. They bowed to a golden statue rising above them, a figure that radiated both glory and rot. Saitama stood among them, an outsider wrapped in dust and silence. A soldier noticed him, shouted something in a language he couldn't understand, and raised his rifle. The shot rang out. The bullet struck his forehead. It fell to the ground with a hollow ping. Everyone froze. Saitama blinked, brushing off the soot from his face. Hey," he said. "Where am I?" No one answered. Only the wind moved, carrying the scent of incense and burnt flesh. Above them, somewhere in the endless storm, the warp rippled again, watching, waiting. And thus began the tale of the man who knew no fear, in a universe where even gods were afraid. Falling. It was not the fall of a man through air or gravity. It was the descent of a thought through madness. Saitama's body, if such a thing could still be defined in this place, was weightless, suspended in a storm that had no direction, no horizon, no mercy. Colors that should not exist bled into each other. Light screamed. Darkness pulsed like a living wound. He tried to open his eyes, but there were too many. The warp did not permit shape or boundary. Here, a man could become a memory before he could even draw breath. At first, he thought it was a dream. He had experienced strange phenomena before: teleportations, godlike beings, monsters that bent space with their presence. But this was different. There was no sound, yet he could hear every thought that had ever been whispered in fear. There was no light, yet his mind was flooded with visions of blood and faith, of machines praying and angels burning. Everywhere he looked, the warp reflected fragments of souls. Some wept, some prayed, others laughed with the hysterical joy of those long damned. It was chaos, and yet there was a rhythm to it, a heartbeat beneath the noise, slow and ancient. He drifted through that madness for what felt like an eternity. Each pulse of the warp carried voices, not words, but impressions carved into his mind like branding iron. You do not belong. You were not made for this realm, but you will serve a purpose. He frowned. Okay, I'm definitely lost. The words barely left his lips before the universe around him reacted. Waves of energy convulsed like living fire. From the formless void rose figures, shifting silhouettes that defied logic. Faces melted into skulls, wings into blades, flesh into light. They gathered around him in reverence and hunger. A mortal who cannot die. A vessel without faith, without fear. A perfect toy for the gods. Their voices layered atop one another until they became a roar that vibrated through his bones. Saitama looked at them, unblinking, unshaken. You guys talk too much. And then, casually, he threw a punch. The result was wrong. There was no sound, no explosion, just silence. A void expanding from his fist like ripples in a black ocean. The daemons vanished, not destroyed, but erased. The very fabric of their existence seemed to recoil. In that instant, the warp itself noticed him. Something vast and hungry stirred beyond perception, a presence that made stars weep and galaxies forget their shape. It leaned toward him like a predator toward an unknown prey. Who dares distort the sea of souls? The voice thundered not from a direction, but from everywhere. Saitama shielded his ears, not because of pain, but because the noise was annoying. Geez, keep it down, will you? I'm trying to think. The warp convulsed in rage. Flames of thought and emotion lashed around him, forming monstrous visions. Towers of screaming saints, rivers of molten faith, worlds devoured by madness. Each image tried to consume his sanity, to make him kneel, to force his mind to break. But Saitama's mind was empty. No faith, no fear, no ambition, only boredom. And the warp, the eternal ocean of emotion and will, could find no purchase in that void. Where a normal soul would scream, his only reaction was a sigh. Is this it? Just colors and shouting? He floated onward. He passed through a nebula of memories, the death of a million worlds seen through the eyes of dying gods. He saw the birth of the emperor, 1,000 shamans, ending their lives in unison to forge a single immortal mind. He witnessed the rise of the Imperium, the endless wars, the burning of terror. The warp wanted him to understand, to feel, to be overwhelmed by the enormity of its truth. But all Saitama felt was a faint, lingering sadness, the kind you get when you realize you've seen this movie before. Then came the laughter. It started as a whisper, wet and gurgling, like a wound speaking. Then it grew, splitting into countless voices, overlapping and echoing through eternity. You amuse me, little one. The air twisted, and before him formed a shape vast, corpulent, and grotesquely joyous. A being whose every breath birthed decay and whose smile dripped with contagion. I am Nurgle, the grandfather of plagues. Even in your stillness I smell life. You will rot beautifully. Saitama tilted his head. You need a bath. The laughter deepened, rolling like thunder across oceans of pus. Defiance? Delightful. You are not of this galaxy, are you? He shrugged. Not sure. Took a wrong turn, I guess. Then allow me to welcome you properly. 1,000 tendrils surged toward him, rivers of filth, each carrying the memory of a dying civilization. They wrapped around him, constricting, melting, infecting. He punched once. The entire landscape of the warp buckled. Nurgle's garden screamed, its diseased vines shriveling into dust. The god's laughter ceased. For the first time in aeons, the Lord of Decay felt something he had long forgotten. Discomfort. Impossible. But before the echo faded, another presence entered. A roar, metallic and divine, tearing through the warp like a blade through flesh. Enough. The voice was pure violence, rage distilled into sound. From the crimson fog emerged a mountain of brass and blood. Khorne, the blood god, crowned in skulls, eyes blazing like dying suns. You intrude upon my realm, pest. You defy the order of slaughter. Saitama looked up, unimpressed. You talk even louder than the last guy. The god clenched his massive fist, and the entire dimension ignited. Rivers of lava and bone cascaded from the sky. Daemons howled in symphony. Let us see if you bleed. A sword the size of a continent descended. Saitama raised his hand. One punch. The blade shattered. The shockwave erased 1,000 screaming stars. For a brief, horrifying moment, Khorne did not move. The god of endless war stood still. He looked down at his own hand, severed from his arm, burning with golden fire. Saitama exhaled. That's it? You sure you're a god? The blood god's roar shook existence. You are no mortal. You are an abomination of balance. You are wrong. The warp screamed. Every chaos god felt it a rupture, a paradox they could not consume. And somewhere, far beyond the warp, on the golden throne of mankind, the Emperor opened his eyes. Saitama didn't know it yet. He didn't understand the gravity of what had happened, how a simple, bored man from a dying world had just torn a hole through the laws of chaos itself. He only knew one thing. For the first time in his life, something out there had reacted to his punch. He looked at his hand. It trembled not from fear, but from the faint spark of something dangerously close to excitement. Finally, he whispered, almost to himself, maybe this world can hit back. And with that thought, he fell deeper, into the burning madness of the 41st millennium. Silence greeted him when he awoke. Not the silence of peace, but the suffocating quiet that follows mass death when even echoes refuse to linger. Saitama blinked, pushing himself up from the ground. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of ozone and burnt metal. A grey fog drifted through the ruins, carrying the faint taste of iron and smoke. He rubbed the back of his head, frowning slightly. Guess I landed a bit rough. The world around him was alien, yet hauntingly familiar. Towering spires of black stone reached toward a bruised sky, their surfaces carved with symbols that pulsed faintly with golden light. The ground beneath him was fractured, littered with shattered icons and what looked disturbingly like melted bone. A city stretched before him, vast, cathedral-like, and dead. He walked forward, his footsteps echoing through the emptiness. The architecture seemed impossible, a mix of machine and faith, of gears embedded in altars and stained glass depicting battles that had lasted millennia. The people who built this place had worshipped war itself. Every corner whispered of fanaticism. Every mural sang hymns to a god he did not know. Yet, something about it all felt heavy. Not just the air. The meaning of this place was weight. Saitama squinted up at a massive statue, a man in golden armor, face serene, hands raised toward the heavens. Even from here, he could sense the reverence, the desperation carved into its form. The Emperor protects. Read the inscription at its base, written in a language his mind somehow understood. He tilted his head. Emperor, huh? Must be the big boss around here. A sudden noise broke the stillness, clanking metal, hurried boots, the low hum of machinery. From behind a crumbled wall emerged figures clad in flak armor, their helmets bearing faded imperial insignias. Their eyes glowed faintly behind cracked visors as they raised their lasguns in unison. Identify yourself, heretic, one of them barked. Saitama blinked. Tourist? They didn't appreciate the answer. The first shot came instantly, a beam of red energy slicing through the haze and striking him square in the chest. He looked down. The armor around his torso smoked faintly, the cloth singed but intact. He sighed. More shots followed, dozens, then hundreds, lighting up the ruins like fireworks. Bolter shells tore through statues, grenades exploded in clouds of sacred dust. The soldiers shouted prayers as they fired, invoking names like Terra, the Throne, and the God Emperor. When the smoke finally cleared, the man they had tried to kill was still standing, unburned, unmoved, expressionless. The lead sergeant lowered his weapon, trembling. By the throne, what are you? Saitama shrugged. Just a guy looking around. He took a step forward. The soldiers panicked. One screamed something about daemon manifestation, another about psychic corruption. They fired again, blind with terror. This time, he didn't dodge. He didn't even flinch. He raised a single hand, and the air shifted. A small shockwave rippled outward, soft and lazy, like a sigh. The bullets froze mid-air, then crumbled into dust. A moment later, every soldier was on the ground, not torn apart, not bleeding, simply unconscious. Their weapons lay scattered, their faith unbroken even in sleep, Saitama stared at them for a long while, his brow furrowed. They look scared. Why? As he walked past their fallen forms, he noticed the insignias painted on their armor, wings, skulls, and the burning sun. There was pride there, but also fear, the kind of devotion born not from love, but from desperation. They prayed to survive, not to be saved. He found that strangely sad. Further into the city, he saw the true scale of what had happened here. Entire blocks reduced to ash, banners of the Imperium burned to tatters, and streets lined with bodies arranged as if for ritual. Some knelt, hands clasped in prayer. Others still clutched weapons, eyes wide open, staring into eternity. All of them had died facing the same direction, toward the statue of the Emperor. He followed their gaze. The golden monolith loomed over the ruins, cracked but not fallen. Its eyes seemed to watch him, judging, questioning. And for the first time in a long while, Saitama felt small. A faint sound drew his attention, a whisper carried by the wind. He turned. There, kneeling among the corpses, was a single survivor, a priest in tattered robes, his face pale and his hands shaking as he traced a sigil of the Aquila in the dust. When he saw Saitama, his eyes widened in awe and terror. He began muttering in a frantic voice, switching between prayer and panic. "O Holy Emperor, shield me from the warp spawn, deliver thy servant from false light." Saitama raised a hand gently. "Hey, calm down. I'm not gonna hurt you." The priest froze. His gaze drifted to the man's hand, ungloved, perfectly clean amid all the filth, and then up to his face, emotionless yet somehow human. "You are not of this world," the priest whispered. Saitama scratched his cheek. "Yeah, I kinda figured that out." The priest's expression twisted between awe and grief. "Then you are either a messenger or a curse. Can I be both?" The old man didn't answer. His eyes were filled with something far heavier than fear. He pointed toward the sky, the storm of fire and lightning that churned endlessly above. "The warp opened," he said. "Our city was the first to burn. You came through it." Saitama looked up. The clouds were red, swirling with lightning shaped like veins. Shadows moved within them, enormous, watching, alive. "So that's the warp," he muttered. The priest fell to his knees again, tears mixing with ash. "If you came through that unscarred, then perhaps you are the Emperor's judgment made flesh." Saitama's brow twitched. "Emperors? What now?" "He sends his agents in many forms, angels, saints, weapons. You could be any of them." Saitama stared down at himself, at the worn yellow suit, the torn cape, the dust-covered boots. He looked back at the priest. "Yeah, definitely not an angel." The old man began to pray louder, his voice breaking. It wasn't a prayer of gratitude, it was fear, raw and ancient, begging the universe not to notice them. Saitama wanted to say something, to tell him to relax, but stopped himself. He didn't understand this world, yet its gods, its rules, its endless desperation. All he knew was that everyone seemed terrified of something, of the sky, of the ground, of each other. He looked around at the corpses, the crumbling cathedrals, the blackened banners. "Everyone's scared," he said softly. "But of what?" A tremor shook the city. Far away, a thunderous explosion echoed through the wasteland, followed by the sound of mechanical engines. From the horizon rose shadows, towering walkers of steel and faith, their limbs moving with the precision of living sermons. Their banners bore the same golden insignia, the Imperium of Man. The priest's eyes went wide. "The Inquisition. They have come to purge what remains." Saitama tilted his head, expression blank. "Purge, huh? Sounds fun." But the old man only sobbed. "No one will survive this time." The wind howled. The ground trembled beneath the steps of titanic machines. And as the sky turned crimson once more, Saitama stood silently among the ashes, the weight of a dead empire pressing down upon him. Somewhere, high above, unseen by mortal eyes, the Emperor stirred a flicker of curiosity amid a billion prayers. A presence had entered his domain, a presence the warp itself could not corrupt. And thus began, the legend whispered in Mechanicus data vaults and inquisitorial records alike, of the God Puncher, the man who fell from nowhere into the age of endless war. The first thing Saitama noticed was the smell. The air itself reeked of sterility, like someone had boiled all life out of it. The fog that had once cloaked the city was gone now, replaced by the mechanical hiss of purification vents. The ashes had been swept aside, the corpses burned to smoke. And from the smoke came order. Lines of soldiers in black armor advanced through the ruins with machine precision. Servo skulls floated above them, their metallic wings humming, lenses glowing like miniature suns. Each carried a burning incense globe, the scent of which made even the dust seem disciplined. At the center of it all came a figure dressed not for war, but for judgment. A coat of dark leather hung heavy with purity seals, each strip of parchment covered in cramped high Gothic script. A rosette gleamed upon his chest, shaped like an 8-pointed star encircling a single eye. His face was pale and expressionless, but his eyes burned with a cold, bureaucratic fire. An inquisitor of the Holy Ordos. Saitama sat cross-legged on a broken column, watching them work. He looked oddly out of place, a man in a yellow jumpsuit amid a tide of armored zealots. They formed a perimeter around him without a word. The Inquisitor stepped forward, flanked by 2 hulking space marines in crimson armor. Their pauldrons bore the sigil of the Angel's Penitent, a chapter whose name alone spoke of blood and guilt. Saitama raised a hand lazily. "Yo." The Inquisitor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at him for a long, clinical moment, as if dissecting a corpse that refused to die. Then he spoke, voice calm but edged with iron. "Identify yourself." Saitama tilted his head. "I'm Saitama. Hero for fun." The Inquisitor's brow twitched. "Heretic titles will not save you." He gestured, and one of the Marines stepped forward, leveling a plasma cannon. The weapon hummed, the air around its barrel warping from the heat of a miniature sun waiting to be unleashed. Saitama sighed. "You people sure like aiming things." The Inquisitor's gaze never wavered. "You appeared during a warp incursion. Entire battalions died the moment you arrived. No demonic trace remains, no psychic signature, no gene record. You are not registered within any Imperial archive." He took a slow step closer. "So I will ask again. What are you?" Saitama scratched his cheek, thinking, Bald guy? Unemployed? Kinda hungry?" A murmur rippled through the soldiers. One of them made the sign of the Aquila across his chest, whispering a prayer under his breath. The Inquisitor's face remained carved from stone. "Blasphemy. You mock the Emperor's judgment." He gestured sharply. "Restrain him." The Marines advanced, massive hands reaching for Saitama's shoulders. The ground trembled with their steps. Saitama didn't move until one of them grabbed his arm. A metallic clank echoed through the air, the sound of gauntlet meeting immovable flesh. The Marine tried to tighten his grip. It didn't work. Saitama turned his head slightly, eyes half-lidded. "You might want to loosen up. You'll hurt yourself." Before the Marine could react, Saitama stood. The motion was small, almost lazy. Yet the shockwave that followed sent the massive warrior skidding backward across the plaza, his armor dented but his body unharmed. The Inquisitor didn't flinch. He only whispered a single word: "Abomination." A dozen guns rose in unison. The Inquisitor raised his hand, then stopped. Something else had changed. The world itself seemed to hold its breath. The light dimmed, the air thickened, and a pressure older than time crept across the ruins. The servo skulls froze mid-air, their mechanical wings trembling as static consumed their vox units. Saitama frowned. "Huh. That's new." The Inquisitor's voice dropped to a reverent whisper. "He watches." Far above them, through the storm, a faint glow rippled across the sky, a presence vast and unseen. It was not light as mortals understood it, but the attention of something divine or monstrous. Every soldier dropped to one knee. The Marines bowed their heads. The Inquisitor turned toward the heavens and whispered, "By the throne, his gaze is upon us." Saitama followed their eyes. He saw nothing, just clouds and lightning. Still, he could feel it, a distant awareness brushing against his mind, curious yet cautious. It wasn't hostile. It was watching him. He rubbed his temple. "You guys sure make a big deal out of staring contests." The Inquisitor's expression hardened again. The Emperor's sight falls where danger walks. You are no mere mutant. He circled Saitama slowly, his boots crunching against broken glass. A weapon, perhaps, or a daemon disguised in flesh. Your power defies every law of the materium. Tell me, whose will do you serve? Saitama looked up at the ruined statue of the Emperor, its face eroded by time. Whose will? My own, I guess. Never really thought about it. The Inquisitor's tone turned sharp. Then you are a rogue force, and a rogue force must be contained. He drew a relic pistol from his side ancient, engraved with sigils of sanctity. The muzzle glowed faint blue as a psychic ward activated. The Inquisitor aimed. Saitama sighed, almost pitying him. The shot rang out a bolt of purifying energy streaking toward its target. It struck Saitama directly in the chest. The light flared, then vanished. He brushed a faint scorch mark from his suit. That tickled. The Inquisitor's composure cracked for the first time. He looked at the gun, then at the man, then at the heavens. Emperor, preserve me. Saitama rubbed his neck awkwardly. Look, I'm not here to start anything. I just fell through, whatever that red storm thing was. I'm kinda lost. The Inquisitor didn't answer immediately. His mind was a battlefield, faith warring with logic, fear wrestling with awe. He finally spoke, voice low. If what you say is true, then you are a danger greater than any daemon, for even the warp itself recoils from you. Saitama frowned. The warp? That what you call the scary space goo stuff? No one answered. The soldiers remained on their knees, heads bowed, whispering litanies of protection. The Inquisitor stepped closer, his tone quieter now, but far more dangerous. I could destroy this world to keep you from spreading. He meant it. There was no bluff in his eyes, only the cold, absolute conviction of a man who had killed planets in the name of salvation. Saitama met his gaze, unimpressed. Destroy the world. Man, you guys really overreact to visitors. A long silence followed. The two men, one who believed himself the instrument of divine wrath, the other too powerful to care, stared at each other. Then, without warning, the Inquisitor holstered his weapon. Very well, he said softly. If you are to be judged, it will not be by me. He turned to his soldiers. Transmit a request to Terra. We have found something new. The phrase something new rippled through the ranks like an electric current. No one dared to repeat it aloud. The Inquisitor looked back once more. You will accompany us to the fortress monastery. Do not resist. Saitama shrugged. Sure, as long as there's food. The convoy departed hours later. Tanks rolled through the ruins, carrying relics, prisoners, and one man who wasn't supposed to exist. As the transports rumbled toward the horizon, the Inquisitor glanced back at the city they left behind, now little more than dust under the cold eye of the Emperor's statue. He whispered to himself, almost in prayer, if this man is truly mortal, then may the Emperor forgive us all. Saitama looked out the window of the armored vehicle, chin resting on his palm. Man, he muttered, this place takes itself way too seriously. The storm of the warp rolled far above them, unseen yet listening, as the Imperium carried its newest anomaly into the heart of its endless war. The fortress was not a building. It was a confession carved in stone. The transport rumbled to a halt at the base of a structure so vast it seemed to scrape the stars themselves. Its towers vanished into storm clouds, its gates sculpted from the skulls of traitors and saints alike. Every inch of its black marble skin was engraved with prayers, not words of peace, but of obedience. As Saitama stepped out, his boots clicked against the metallic floor. Soldiers flanked him on both sides, their movements ritualistic, mechanical, fanatical. The air vibrated with the hum of hymns piped through the fortress walls, a low metallic chant that never stopped, never wavered. Through purity, purpose, through purpose, redemption, through redemption, eternity. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking up at the gates. Big place. Overcompensating much? The Inquisitor ignored him, his tone sharp as a blade. Within these walls, even gods are measured. Cool, Saitama replied flatly. Where's the cafeteria? They led him inside. The corridors were endless, narrow, dimly lit by candles mounted in skull-shaped holders. Mechanisms of unknown function lined the walls, tubes pulsing faintly with sacred fluids. Every few meters, robed adepts of the Adeptus Mechanicus worked in silence, their faces replaced with lenses and steel. They didn't look at Saitama. They didn't have to. The whispers that followed him were enough. A psychic null? No, something beyond classification. He is not of this reality. He walked quietly, letting them stare. None of this frightened him, but something about the place felt heavy, like even his presence couldn't lift the weight of its faith. Finally, they entered the chamber of evaluation. It was circular, cathedral-like. Candles burned in massive iron cages. Icons of the Emperor loomed overhead, eyes glowing faintly with internal fire. In the center stood a great stone table carved with runes and fitted with chains that glimmered faintly with energy fields. Saitama stared at it. "You're kidding, right? Chains? Do I look like I'm gonna run off?" The Inquisitor didn't answer. He nodded once, and the guards gestured him forward. Saitama sighed and sat down obediently, resting his hands on the table. "Okay, fine, do your thing." A group of psychers entered, their heads shaved, eyes bandaged, robes marked with the sigil of the Ordo Malleus. The air around them shimmered, heavy with unseen energy. Each bore a staff topped with an iron skull. One of them spoke, voice hollow and distant. "We will touch his mind. We will find his origin." Saitama frowned. "Touch my what?" The psychers began to chant. Symbols burned in the air, lines of light, twisting into incomprehensible geometries. A wind rose from nowhere, and the candles flickered violently. The psychic field wrapped around him like invisible hands, probing, testing, searching. Then, nothing. The light died. The chanting stopped. One by one, the psychers collapsed, blood leaking from their eyes, their ears, their noses. The smell of ozone filled the room. The Inquisitor's face darkened. "Report." One surviving psyker coughed, trembling. "My lord, there is nothing. No presence, no soul signature, no resonance. He does not exist in the immaterium. He rejects it." The Inquisitor's voice was a whisper. "Even the warp cannot see him." Saitama blinked. "So, I passed?" No one answered. The Inquisitor walked slowly toward him, eyes locked on his face. He looked less like a man now, more like an idea, the embodiment of a question that had no answer. "Tell me, Saitama," he said, his voice calm but trembling beneath its own control. "If you do not serve the warp, and you are not of the Emperor's light, then what sustains you?" Saitama scratched his chin. "I dunno, protein, ramen maybe?" The silence that followed was almost physical. A priest whispered, "He mocks the throne." Another hissed, "Burn him before he spreads corruption." The Inquisitor raised a hand for silence. His eyes never left Saitama's. "You speak as if you are above divine judgment." "Judgment," Saitama said quietly. "I'm just a guy who punches things. I don't care about your gods." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. A dozen soldiers raised their weapons. A priest screamed. Heresy. Bolters cocked. Power swords flared to life. The chamber filled with the sound of furious faith ready to become fire. Saitama stayed still. His eyes, usually bored and distant, now narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in pity. He looked around at the faces twisted by fear, devotion, and hatred. These people weren't evil. They were afraid of anything that didn't fit their perfect, crumbling order. He stood up slowly. The chains shattered at his touch. "Enough," the Inquisitor commanded, raising his hand again. "Stand down." But no one listened. The priests chanted, the soldiers aimed, and one of them fired a single bolt round, bright and holy, screaming across the room. It hit Saitama in the shoulder. The explosion lit the chamber for a split second, then faded into silence. When the smoke cleared, he was still standing, not even scorched. He looked at the hole in his sleeve, sighed, and flicked the dust off. "I told you," he said softly. "You'll just hurt yourselves." Then he moved. A breeze. A heartbeat. And every weapon in the room fell apart, cut cleanly in half, melted by sheer kinetic shock. No one died. Not one. But the walls cracked, the stone table split, and the Emperor's statue above them trembled as if in awe. The room fell silent. The Inquisitor's voice was barely a whisper. "You could have destroyed us all." Saitama shrugged. "Why would I? You people are weird, but you're trying." The Inquisitor stared at him for a long moment, then turned away. He gestured for the guards to stand down. "Seal this chamber. No one outside these walls is to know what transpired here." He paused, then looked back at Saitama. "Until we understand what you are, you will remain under Imperial observation. Do not resist, and perhaps the Emperor himself will judge you worthy." Saitama stretched, yawning. "Sure, just don't forget dinner." As they led him through the corridors again, he noticed something strange. The fortress no longer felt oppressive. The chanting, the lights, even the hum of the machines, they seemed quieter now, uncertain. He glanced back at the chamber doors closing behind him, sealing away the bodies of the psychers who had dared to look into his mind. He didn't understand their gods or their wars, but he did understand one thing. In a world ruled by fear, his existence alone had broken something fundamental. For the first time, the Imperium had seen something it couldn't name. And for the first time, the warp had flinched. High above, in the silent void between worlds, something stirred. The Emperor's golden gaze flickered again upon his throne. A whisper, ancient, weary, and curious, echoed across the Astronomicon. A mortal who defies the warp, or a void given form. The Inquisition's reports would call him the Paradox. But the soldiers who survived that day would remember him differently. They would tell stories, hushed and fearful, of the bald man who smiled at the Emperor's judgment and walked away unchanged. Night inside the fortress was not night as Saitama knew it. There were no stars, only the drone of sanctified engines and the red pulse of lumen bulbs that imitated the heartbeat of a sleeping god. Vents breathed incense like the fortress itself required sacrament to live. Somewhere far below, an organ the size of a cathedral pushed hymns through iron lungs, its chords tuned to keep mortal terror barely manageable. He had been given a cell, though given was generous. It was a cube of black stone veined with cables and prayer-etched copper. The door had no handle, only a slot through which meal bricks arrived with clockwork pity. Servo skulls drifted past the bars like curious moths, their eye lenses dilating whenever he exhaled. Saitama lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling. He had tried to count the rivets. He had finished. He had tried to sleep. Sleep refused. So he listened. At first, there was only the fortress, the hydraulics, the liturgies, the footsteps of men who carried duty like a disease. But beneath that faint and far, something else murmured. It was not a sound. It was the idea of a sound, like remembering laughter in a dream you didn't have. When he followed it with his attention, the walls seemed to bend. The lumen bulbs lengthened into red comets. The prayers became whispers not meant for human throats. "You do not belong." The notion brushed his mind as lightly as dust. He blinked, sat up. He had heard voices before braggart gods, melodramatic monsters, things that believed volume could substitute for meaning. This wasn't that. This was intimate, patient, the way an ocean might address a pebble. He stood and crossed to the bars. The corridor was empty except for the slow drift of two servo skulls. "Hey," he said, voice flat. "You hearing that?" The skulls rotated in silence. One unfurled a parchment tongue, observation record, subject breathes. Then they moved on, satisfied that breathing existed. The whisper returned, closer now, threading through the stale air. No fear, no faith, a perfect silence. How exquisite. Saitama frowned. "You again." The cot trembled. Dust lifted in the room and began to turn, not falling, but circling, as if the air itself had found a purpose. He could not see the speaker, but he could feel the attention coalescing, thoughtful, delighted, cruel, a garden's patient rot, a butcher's fondness for knives well used. "There is room for you in decay," the presence cooed. "I have cradled empires to sleep. I will swaddle you in endings. Rot is a kind teacher, little stranger. It asks nothing but time." Saitama scratched his cheek. Smells like moldy soup. You, the green one from before. The cell's candles hiccuped. Delight rolled through the notion like a warm infection. Names are for the healthy. But you may call me grandfather, as all children do in the end. He had nothing to throw at a presence, so he threw his voice instead. Grandpa, huh? That's cute. He shrugged. I'm not looking to join any clubs. Thanks, though. The whisper sweetened. You misunderstand. You are already my art. Your flesh refuses, but even refusal blossoms. Imagine it, a new variety of plague, not death, but permanence. I could grow a garden of inviolable things. Pass, he yawned. I like shampoo. Silence, then an amused ripple, a pity. Another will bid more. The temperature dropped. The red bulbs bled into a darker crimson, like clotted suns. The air sharpened. The incense took on a metallic edge that tasted like a bitten tongue. Bone-deep pressure kissed the floor, heavy, purposeful, ritual. It felt like a hand closing around the entire cell. Another attention arrived. Where the first had been damp fertility, this was a whetstone. It pared away comfort and language alike until only force remained. Fight. The word did not echo. It impaled. The cot screamed under his fingers. The prayer-etched copper glowed dull, as if ashamed. The whisper hammered on. Fight now, fight forever, bleed a river and name it meaning. Saitama rolled his shoulders. We did this dance already. He looked at his fists, then at the wall. You want me to punch the room until it builds you a stadium. An ember of surprise. You mock battle? I mock boredom. He sat back down. You smell like pennies. The pressure recoiled, not defeated, but insulted, and the cell exhaled. Somewhere above, he heard chains as thick as trees drag across stone, returning to their leashes. The red bulbs warmed back toward life. A third attention seeped in slowly, too careful to be kind. It tasted like blue fire and geometry stacked on lies. When it touched the boundaries of his thought, they did not bend. They reorganized, as if tested by a surveyor with infinite patience. Curious, said the scholar's voice. A variable that refuses the equation. Are you a gap in the map or the cartographer's mistake? Saitama blinked. You sound like a tax office. I am the beginning of every plan and the end of every certainty. The voice smiled without lips. If you cannot be moved, you can be used. A constant in an untrustworthy universe. How I would love to build on you. People keep trying to build on me, he said. It's weird. The blue fire mind pressed harder, searching for edges to label. It found none. What it found instead was emptiness that refused to be framed as absence, a choice that was simply itself. After a moment that might have been an hour, the scholar withdrew with polite menace. Another time, constant. You cannot be corrupt, but you can be placed. The cell cooled. The incense lost its sting. Saitama let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. So, green soup grandpa, coin smell gym coach, and a science teacher. Great. He dropped back onto the cot. What a neighborhood. He almost missed the fourth presence because it did not announce itself. It peeled nothing from him. It promised nothing. It was simply absent. The dust fell still. The lumen bulbs hummed as if relieved to be unobserved. Even the hymns seemed to step back. The door slid open with a whisper. No alarms, no keys. A figure stood on the threshold, framed by the corridor's weak glow. Tall, armored in pale matte plates that swallowed light, face bare and resolute. Her eyes were not cold, they were precise. Her presence was not a pressure but a hunger's lack. The warp did not cling to her, it avoided her like a wound avoids salt. Saitama sat up. Hi. The woman inclined her head, a gesture as spare as a knife. She wore no sigils, only a small brand at the throat. A double teardrop motif, simple and absolute. I am a sister of silence, she said. Her voice had no echo. The corridor accepted it, then forgot. Name. Saitama. A pause that measured him. You nullify the immaterium by existing. Is that bad? For psychers, lethal. For daemons, catastrophic. For the Imperium, inconvenient. She entered the cell. The door closed itself, ashamed to have been open. You speak with the warp? It spoke at me, he said, scratching his cheek. I told it I like shampoo. Her mouth almost learned a smile, then remembered discipline. The gods courted you? Like door-to-door salesman. He gestured vaguely. I'm not buying. Good. She studied the cot, then the prayer-etched seam where wall met floor. You are a paradox, and paradox invites war. Some here will wish to weaponize you. Others will prefer a clean execution and a purer story. She met his eyes. I am here to keep you uninteresting long enough to choose. He considered that. I'm usually pretty good at uninteresting. Not anymore. She stepped nearer, and the sensation of lack intensified. It was not discomfort. It was clarity. He realized he could not hear the distant organ while she stood there. He realized how loud the universe had been. You feel different, he said. I am a blank, a silence shaped into armor. She tilted her head. Near me, the warp cannot whisper. Near you, it loses its voice entirely. A breath. Together, we are quiet. He nodded slowly. That sounds nice. It will draw knives, she said, but you are difficult to cut. He thought about the Inquisitor's stare, about the fortress that prayed with its teeth, about the way men around here held faith like a tourniquet. He thought about boredom, and then about choice. What do you want? He asked. Order, she said without sadness. A space where children can memorize their own names before they learn the Emperor's. She glanced at the door. And perhaps a world that does not need to invent new kinds of martyrdom to survive its mornings. Seems reasonable. Here, it is treason. They stood in the manageable silence for a while. He had never been good at conversations that asked him to be someone else. This one asked him to be what he already was, uncomplicated, unyielding, awake. Footsteps approached, measured, inevitable. The Inquisitor's cadence. He walked like a verdict. The sister turned her head toward the corridor. The air regained a little of its old hysteria. I will return, she said, when your answers become dangerous. He nodded. Thanks for the quiet. She left as she had come, with nothing in her wake. The door whispered shut. The hymns remembered themselves and resumed their work. The whispers did not. He waited for Rot's caress, for war's command, for clever geometry. Nothing came. The ocean had discovered a shore it could not devour, and for now refused to argue with it. Saitama lay down and closed his eyes. He did not sleep, but he rested, and that was almost as strange. Outside the cell, orders multiplied like insects. Cables carried words to cathedrals. Vox relays stitched prayers to protocols. Custody transfer, threat indices, contingency rights. In rooms that smelled like oil and old victory, men argued about which apocalypse best suited the public good. None of it mattered until morning, and morning, here, was something you earned by not dying in the night. He exhaled, long and even. Guess I'll wait. Above him, between fortress stone and god-haunted storm, a thought he couldn't name, watched with the care of a surgeon and the worry of a father. Not emperor, not daemon. Something in the space between commandment and choice, wondering what a universe might do with a man who made even the warp whisper. And somewhere in the chamber where failures are preserved as lessons, a fresh file received an unprintable designation. The clerk did not read it. His eyes would have bled. He stamped it anyway. The paradox. Active. The fortress breathed. The night pretended to end. Dawn came to the fortress like a blade sliding from a wound. The sky bled rust-colored light across the towers, gilding the statues of martyrs with fire. From the parapets, the banners of the Imperium hung motionless, soaked with night rain and penitence. Saitama stood on a balcony beneath the observation spire, his borrowed cloak fluttering faintly in the wind. Below him stretched a world that was never meant for peace, a graveyard disguised as a planet. Endless trenches, cities built atop catacombs of older wars, oceans turned into industrial soup. Even from here he could smell it. Oil, iron, and incense. He leaned on the railing, expression flat. You guys ever take a day off? Behind him, boots clicked on stone. The Inquisitor approached, flanked by the same crimson-armored Marines who now treated him as if he were a holy relic that might explode at any moment. This planet, the Inquisitor began, is Cadentis too. Once a shrine world, now a testing ground, The Ordo Mechanicus have called it the Anvil of Faith. Saitama squinted. Testing ground for what? For miracles, the man said. And monsters. The wind shifted. Far on the horizon, a storm gathered not clouds, but ash. Within that haze, faint sparks flickered like dying stars. He realized they were explosions. A Xeno incursion, the Inquisitor continued. Tyrannid remnants from the last crusade. The Mechanicus require live specimens for study. The Adeptus Astartes will purge the rest. Saitama turned his head, interest finally stirring. So, there's a fight? The Inquisitor's lip twitched. A war. By midday, they stood aboard a gunship cutting through the orange sky. Below, entire legions moved like veins of metal and fire. Titans marched, walking cathedrals taller than mountains, their steps sending shockwaves through the earth. Clouds of dust rose around armored convoys, each vehicle engraved with litanies that glowed as if afraid to stop praying. Through the viewport, Saitama watched all of it with quiet curiosity. That's a lot of guys. The Emperor demands sacrifice, the Inquisitor said simply. He didn't answer. In the distance, streaks of violet cut across the heavens, spore pods descending from orbit. When they hit the ground, the impact rippled through the plains like heartbeats. Then the screeching began. The gunship trembled as it descended. Sirens howled. The Vox systems filled with overlapping chants and screams. For terror. By his will, we cleanse. Hold the line. They landed amid a forward trench line. The ground was mud and blood, indistinguishable. Soldiers in grey-green flak armor scrambled around, their eyes wild but faithful. Servitors dragged ammunition boxes, their mechanical limbs twitching with programmed piety. Saitama stepped out. A soldier nearby froze, his prayer mid-sentence. Word of the bold stranger had already spread. A rumor whispered in disbelief. A weapon of the Emperor, a saint of the void. Or perhaps, his punishment made flesh. He stretched lazily. So, where are the bugs? The sky answered. A shape blotted out the sun, vast wings of chitin and rage. The first tyrannid swooped low, its screech tearing through Vox channels. Dozens followed, descending in swarms. Lasguns fired upward, beams like rain against an ocean. The Inquisitor's voice crackled over the command Vox. Contain the breach, let the Emperor judge the Xenos. Saitama watched one of the beasts crash into a tank column, claws shredding ceramite like wet paper. He sighed. Guess that's my cue. Before anyone could stop him, he stepped forward and vanished. Not teleported, simply moved, too fast for the eye to follow. A heartbeat later, the horizon erupted. Soldiers blinked against the flash. What had been a swarm was now a field of dust drifting down like snow. At its center stood Saitama, cape torn, expression unchanged. A single tyrannid remained a towering creature, larger than a titan's foot, its body a nightmare of armor and hunger. It roared, splitting the clouds. Saitama tilted his head. You loud ones are always the same. He threw one punch. The shockwave erased sound. The creature ceased to exist, reduced to vapor and memory. Even the storm seemed to pause, as though the planet itself were reconsidering its loyalties. In the command bunker, the Inquisitor gripped the edge of the hololithic map. Omnissiah preserve us, he whispered. The seismic sensors had flatlined. The entire grid of enemy signatures had disappeared, not retreated, not jammed, simply gone. He unmade them, a tech adept said in awe. Not slain, erased. The machine spirit weeps at the data loss. The Inquisitor looked toward the viewing slit, where the distant figure stood amid the settling dust. No, the machine spirit trembles. It knows it has seen something beyond its pattern. Saitama stared at the crater he had made. It stretched for kilometers, its edges glowing faintly from frictional heat. The sky above began to darken again, not from clouds, this time from shadow. Something vast was moving in orbit. He glanced upward, narrowing his eyes. The outline of a ship loomed, not tyrannid, not imperial. The hull glimmered with green energy, carved in runes that pulsed like veins. The Vox in the trench burst alive with static and fear. Mechanicus report unidentified object class designation. Necron World Engine. Fragment. A murmur ran through the ranks. Even the Inquisitor's voice lost its certainty. The planet is reacting. It remembers the ancient war. The ground beneath Saitama shifted. The mud hardened into glass. The air filled with a sound like a choir reversed. Columns of metal rose from beneath the surface, each one humming with impossible frequency. From the shattered earth, a new army awoke. Necron warriors' metallic skeletons, eyes burning with the cold light of eternity, marched silently into the daylight. Their weapons hummed with energy that unmade atoms. Above them, monolithic pylons turned slowly toward the stars, locking into formation. Saitama watched, mildly impressed. So the planet's got robots now. Neat. The first volley hit him. A beam of viridian light, brighter than the sun, cut through the air and struck his chest. The ground behind him exploded into a canyon. When the dust cleared, he was still standing. He looked down at his slightly smoking suit and sighed. "You're gonna make laundry day impossible." From the command bunker. Panic. The Necron defense grid is awakening. Atmospheric interference rising. The planet itself is retaliating. The Inquisitor's face went pale. Cadentis Vitae was built upon a tomb world. The Mechanicus never unearthed the core. The Xenos were merely bait. He turned to the Voxcaster. "Signal the fleet. Orbital purge, immediately." "But my lord Saitama." "Do it." Above the atmosphere, Imperial battleships reoriented. Bombardment protocols initiated. The voice of the Emperor was invoked through steel and flame. Millions of tons of ordnance descended in synchronized fire. The clouds turned to vapor, the oceans to mirrors. At the center of it all, Saitama looked up at the falling light, his brow furrowed. Seriously? He jumped. The shockwave of his leap shattered the plateau. He rose past the bombardment lines, past the debris field, until he was face to face with the falling shells. He punched once. Everything stopped. The explosion folded inward, collapsing into a sphere of blinding white before vanishing completely, a silence so absolute it deafened. Below, the Necron pylons froze. The bombardment ceased. The planet itself quieted. When he landed, the Earth accepted him like an apology. The battlefield was gone, replaced by glass plains reflecting a sky newly calm. The Inquisitor arrived hours later, escorted by the Sister of Silence. He looked around, unable to comprehend what he saw. "You halted an orbital strike," he whispered. Saitama shrugged. "Yeah, too noisy." The Inquisitor knelt, not in worship but in exhaustion. "You have done what titans, fleets, and faith could not. You have silenced a planet." The Sister of Silence studied Saitama quietly, her expression unreadable. In her presence, the air felt pure again, untouched by warp or worship. "Silence," she said softly. "He brings silence wherever he walks." Saitama scratched his neck. "I just wanted a nap." Far above, the Emperor felt it the moment when Cadentis VIII fell silent. Not death, not victory, simply nothing. And in that nothing, he heard something new, the faintest heartbeat of balance. Night came to Cadentis VIII without stars. The bombardment had ceased. The pylons had buried their anger, and the trenches newly made and already obsolete filled with glassy rain. Inside the fortress, candles guttered as if exhausted by their own faith. Choir servitors slept with mouths still open, tongues inked with prayers, breathing the same tired hymns in smaller, slower loops. Saitama stood at a high embrasure, watching the planet fail to remember how to move. Below, work gangs dragged broken icons back to upright positions, as if the posture of a statue could convince the morning to arrive on time. The air smelled like cooled thunder and wet ash. He felt none of it. He simply watched, a man-shaped quiet. He did not notice when the world stopped. Not the fortress, not the engines, the world. A hush so complete it reclassified sound as superstition. The red lumen bulb above the door froze in mid-flicker. The drip from a cracked ceiling duct turned into a glass bead that forgot how to fall. Breath became decor. Time admired itself and did not proceed. A light not bright, not kind, stood beside him. It did not cast shadow. Shadows chose to belong to it. The figure wore no crown and needed none. Gold was implied, not shown. Humanity was a memory preserved in architecture. Jaw like a triumphal arch, eyes like locked reliquaries, presence like the blueprint of an empire. Something of a throne moved behind him, not a chair but a refusal carved into eternity. Saitama turned his head. "Hey." The figure regarded him the way continents consider weather. When he finally spoke, the sound was the correct volume for truth. "You have interfered." It was not accusation, it was measurement. Saitama scratched his cheek. "Everyone keeps saying that." "Because it is so." The knot light around the figure bristled with other selves, a general who had conquered time zones by staring at them, a father who had lost sons he was still in the process of inventing, a god who had the terrible courtesy to be real. The room felt suddenly borrowed. Even Saitama's body seemed on loan. "Are you the Emperor?" he asked. The figure did not confirm. The universe did it for him. Somewhere beyond the fortress, the Astronomicon brightened, then dimmed again, as though embarrassed to be seen straining. "Names are anchor stones," he said. "This is a sea that drowns anchors." Saitama nodded slowly. "You're very serious." The long slaughter of a species has few jokes worth telling. They stood at the window together, two kinds of silence attempting to negotiate. The planet made no noise. The sky had mislaid its storms. For a moment that stretched like old incense smoke, the galaxy behaved. "You arrived without prayer," the Emperor said. "You act without sanction. The Immaterium cannot translate you. That is unprecedented." Saitama looked down at his gloves. "I fell through a red storm, bumped into loud people who talked about fighting forever. I said no." "Yes," the Emperor said, and the single syllable carried more history than a library. "You say no to all that takes purchase in men. Fear cannot root in you. Faith cannot harvest you. Ambition finds no soil. You are emptiness shaped into a kindness for which we have no word." Saitama frowned. "Emptiness isn't kind, it's just there." "Exactly." The Emperor considered the glass plains, where war had failed to reproduce itself. Below, laborers hoisted a half-melted aquila. It wilted in their hands like a memory cut from tin. "This Imperium was built to endure a poison the soul cannot survive," he said. "We hardened our myths until they became metals and wore them as armor. We slaughtered to make room for order and called the slaughter order so it would not shame us. I designed a machine to outlive its engineers." He let the sentence rest. "But a machine forgets the reason it was made. It only remembers the ritual required to continue." Saitama watched his reflection in the knot window. It looked like someone who had wandered into a museum by mistake. "Am I breaking your machine? You are proving that it can stop." He did not smile. People had been executed for less. That is terrifying. They faced each other then, not as rivals, but as incompatible proofs. The Emperor's gaze contained entire strategies, entire centuries arranged as chess half-remembered by a god with a migraine. Saitama's gaze contained a grocery list that hadn't mattered in years. "Do you want to be used?" the Emperor asked. "No." "Do you want to be worshipped?" Saitama grimaced. "Definitely no." "Do you want to be left alone?" He thought about it. The fortress, the incense, the way men here swallowed their fear and called it loyalty because they could not afford the luxury of a different word. The Sister of Silence, who had stood in his cell like a cup of water in a city that had forgotten thirst. The Inquisitor, praying with his trigger discipline. "I want a reason," he said. The Emperor's head inclined, a cathedral nodding to a beggar who refused coin. Outside, the paused rain considered resuming, then decided to listen. "There is a reason nobody offered you," he said. "Not victory, not purity, not empire. A breath, mercy." The syllables did not echo. They bent the room around them. "Mercy is expensive," he went on, almost to himself. "Costlier than conquest. It does not propagate as quickly as fear. It offends accountants and generals. My Imperium cannot scale it." His eyes fixed on Saitama. "You can." Saitama blinked. "By not hitting things. By refusing to be entertained by slaughter. By telling men who have only ever used knives that their hands can unclench without shattering. The Emperor's gaze unfocused briefly, as if reading the minutes of a meeting that had not occurred. "There will be consequences." "Always are," Saitama said, "even for sale days." A filament of something like humor crossed the Emperor's face and died with dignity. "Listen," he said, and when he spoke, the fortress remembered its purpose. Walls leaned in, candles dared not gutter, even the glass bead drip at the ceiling strained to hear. "The gods of the warp will court you, the servants of order will cage you, each will name this charity, to destroy what cannot be controlled. You will be accused of treason by both faith and chaos. You will be told that quiet is sin." Saitama looked back out at the planet. "And you? I will dream of a morning where a child learns the word kind before he learns the word kill." He closed his eyes not to rest, but to be merciful to the world that could not bear his open attention for long. "I am no longer permitted to pray, but I am still allowed to hope." They stood together in that statement. Hope had not been legal here for several millennia. It shivered, trying on the room like a cloak. "Okay," Saitama said at last. "I can try not to make things worse." "You will fail," the Emperor said gently, "and then you will try again. Story of my life." "Yes." The knot light shifted. Far away, the Astronomicon steadied. Somewhere on Terra, a scribe forgot a word he had never learned. On Cadentis Thade, a sister of silence paused mid-step, as if a wind had passed through a windless hall. "One more thing," the Emperor said, and for the first time there was something like urgency in him, something like a father borrowing a moment from a general. "When anger knocks, it will wear the shape of purpose. It will offer you meaning wrapped in crimson. Do not open." Saitama thought of a voice like a metal stadium, the taste of pennies in the air, the way the universe had flexed around a single command. "Fight." He nodded. "Got it. Good." The Emperor looked toward the horizon that the room did not possess, and let the moment end. Time unclenched. The glass bead fell and became a drip again. The red bulb remembered how to flicker. A distant siren apologized for being late to its own alarm. The figure began to fade, not leaving, but reassigning his presence to obligations no mortal could survive. At the threshold of absence, he turned back. "If you must strike," he said, "strike to stop. Men understand that language, even gods do." Saitama considered the advice, then gave it a home. "I'll try. That is more than I have been able to do for a very long time." The room was again only a room. The window was again only a hole in a wall. Wind invented itself and came in to see what had happened. Saitama blew a breath out through his lips. Weird dream. He stood a while longer, watching the work gangs raise the icon again. It stayed upright this time, not because the metal had grown stronger, because the men had learned where to put their hands. The door opened behind him. The Sister of Silence stepped in, eyes calm, presence like a cup of clean water left on a bedside table. She searched his face for damage that left no marks. "Did he come?" she asked, voice small enough not to offend the morning. Saitama shrugged. "Maybe. Did he command you?" "No." She looked relieved in the careful way of someone trained not to waste relief. "Then the day will be survivable." She nodded toward the corridor. "The Inquisitor has questions." "He always does." They walked together, the corridor, accepting their two kinds of quiet. The fortress had resumed its prayers. The engines kept time like patient drummers. Outside, the world pretended to remember how to move. Behind his eyes, a voice with no crown, and every crown persisted like an afterimage. "Strike to stop." Saitama felt his hands open by a fraction he hadn't known they'd closed. Somewhere far from Cadentis 8, something red laughed and began building an arena. There is a silence in the warp that means only one thing. Something terrible is watching. It began as a pulse beneath reality, the heartbeat of an ancient predator. Cadentis the 8 trembled. The horizon fractured like glass struck from the inside. What emerged was not light, nor shadow, but momentum given purpose, a hole in the laws of cause and effect. From it, the smell of copper. From it, the sound of applause made from thunder. Saitama felt the world slip. He had known many strange moments in his life, teleportations, divine dreams, grocery runs on discount days that ended with existential crises, but this felt different. This wasn't movement. This was summons. The air folded, and he was elsewhere. The sky was red, infinite, and angry. It bled into the ground, which was also red, though darker like iron that had learned to remember pain. Rivers of blood coiled between mountains of skulls that reached toward nowhere. Lightning forked through the air, carrying with it a sound like millions of throats chanting the same word in every language. Fight. He landed softly on a hill of bone. His boots sank slightly. He looked around, unimpressed. "Okay," he muttered, "this is new." Across the horizon, the earth convulsed. From the crimson fog rose figures, giants of brass and hate, each carrying a weapon the size of a building. Their armor bore runes that burned like molten scripture. Their eyes were empty sockets filled with hunger. And beyond them, enthroned upon a mountain of skulls that never stopped growing, sat Khorne, the blood god, the first murderer, the eternal war. His form was too large for understanding, too defined for metaphor. His laughter could have been thunder, or artillery, or applause. When he spoke, every atom of the air trembled as if to bow. At last, a soul unshackled by cowardice. Saitama blinked. "You're the loud one again." The laughter shook the planet. Rivers boiled, mountains cracked, and the air turned to knives. "You enter my domain without prayer, without offering, without fear. Do you know where you stand, mortal? Knee-deep in whatever this is?" He poked the ground with his toe. "Pretty gross. You stand in the arena of endless war. Every breath here is battle. Every second, slaughter. Every god, servant, and worm exists to fight or be forgotten." Saitama sighed. "Sounds exhausting." "Exhaustion is for the dead." The blood god leaned forward, his teeth the color of forges. "And you, stranger, are not dead enough." At that signal, the arena awoke. The horizon erupted. Daemons poured forth hundreds, then thousands, each a unique hymn to rage. Some were beasts made of muscle and steel, others swarms of fire and screaming faces. The sky itself began to rain blades. Saitama stood still, expression neutral. He exhaled, his breath forming a small, unremarkable puff of steam in the boiling air. "Well," he said, "guess I'll play along for a bit." The first wave hit. He moved faster than thought, his punches carving shockwaves that flattened armies. Each impact created miniature suns that burned out before they could be admired. Skulls shattered, flesh turned to dust, and the ground began to collapse under the weight of its own destruction. The daemons didn't stop. They couldn't. Their existence depended on forward motion, on endless aggression. They swarmed him like ants trying to drown fire. Saitama kept walking. One punch, silence. 2 punches, silence. 1,000 punches, the same. When he finally stopped, the only thing left moving was the wind. The laughter returned, deeper now, heavier. "You are beautiful," Khorne said. "A weapon shaped by boredom. You kill not for worship, nor hunger, nor pride. You kill because there is nothing else left to do." Saitama brushed dust from his shoulder. "I don't really kill. They just stop existing. It's not personal." "Everything here is personal," the god roared. His breath turned to meteors. "Every strike is prayer. Every death, a confession. Without hatred, what is strength? Without struggle, what is meaning?" Saitama looked up at the monstrous figure, the rivers of blood churning around the throne. "You're asking the wrong guy." "Then who should I ask?" "Someone who's still trying." That answer confused the blood god in a way he hadn't been confused since the first blade had drawn the first drop of blood. The silence that followed was heavier than his rage. He rose from his throne, a movement so large it redefined the horizon. "You will fight me." Saitama sighed. "Of course. For eternity." "Yeah, that's the part that sounds lame." Khorne swung his blade. The act of motion alone created hurricanes. The edge was wide enough to bisect continents, sharp enough to divide history into before and after. The impact never came. Saitama had stepped forward and, with a small, almost polite jab, touched the blade's surface. It shattered. The noise was indescribable, not thunder, not explosion, but absence. Every daemon still alive froze mid-roar, their bodies dissolving into mist. The rivers stopped, the sky dimmed. Saitama stared up at the god. See? This is why I don't spar. Khorne stared down, unblinking, his severed blade reformed in molten silence. You think you have won. You think that victory ends the game. Fool. Here, battle is being. You cannot stop it. You cannot kill it. Even your stillness is another kind of war. Saitama frowned. If everything's war, maybe the problem's you. The god's laughter split the sky again. There is no me without war. I am the wound that keeps the universe awake. Saitama's expression softened pity, not fear. That sounds lonely. For the first time in eternity, the blood god hesitated. He looked at the mortal, at the small, bold creature standing unarmed in the ruins of infinity, and found in that stillness something he did not possess. Peace. You are wrong, Khorne said at last, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. There is no peace here, only pause between screams. Saitama shrugged. Then maybe you should take a nap. The warp cracked. A fissure of light cut through the arena. The gods of chaos, wherever they lingered, turned their attention. Nurgle wept spores of envy. Tzeentch scribbled new equations of disbelief. Slaanesh trembled with hunger for the unknown taste of stillness. Khorne's throne bled fire. You cannot stay. You defy the creed of creation. Yeah, Saitama said. I've been told that before. The god's eyes burned brighter. Then leave, before I make you eternal. Saitama nodded once, without anger or challenge. Sure thing. He turned, took a single step, and reality tore open before him, a rift not of warp or time, but of choice. Through it glowed something that wasn't light but could pretend. He walked through, and the arena screamed his name for the first and last time. When he was gone, Khorne sat back upon his throne of skulls. The rivers began to flow again, but slower, uncertain. He looked at his hand, the one that had once held the perfect weapon, and found it trembling. For the first time since the first murder, the blood god whispered, not to an army, but to himself. If he is not my enemy, what am I? No one answered. The arena, for a heartbeat, forgot how to echo. Far beyond, Saitama emerged into a quiet between worlds, floating amid starlight and whispers of energy. The red storms of the warp faded behind him like a tantrum out of breath. He looked at his fists, then at the endless black. Man, he murmured, everybody here just needs a hobby. Time ceased to be a straight line. Saitama could not tell when the fighting began, or if it had ever truly ended. The warp did not have clocks. It had rhythms, and he had become one of them. The crimson void around him pulsed like a beating heart, painting eternity in shades of fury. He stood upon a sea of bones that floated in nothingness, beneath a sky that never stopped bleeding. When he tried to remember how he'd arrived here, the memories came apart like wet paper. All that remained was motion, his body reacting, his fists connecting, and the sound of things ceasing to exist. He punched, and a mountain of daemon flesh disintegrated. He turned, and another tide of beasts fell upon him. He struck again, and the horizon folded inward. It went on, days, weeks, centuries, or perhaps seconds. The warp made no promises of meaning. Every blow was effortless, every victory meaningless. And yet the war would not die. He had learned to recognize the pattern. Whenever the last enemy fell, the sky would open again, and something new would crawl out, different shapes, louder roars, sharper claws. The warp was learning him, reshaping itself to continue the game he refused to play. Saitama tried to stop. Once. He lowered his hands, let the next creature come. It tore through him, through skin, through bone, through the memory of what he was. Pain flashed bright and brief. When it faded, he was whole again, standing where he'd fallen, the battlefield unchanged. He looked down at his body, then at the beast, still gnawing on the ghost of his death. Guess that doesn't work either. Somewhere in the red mist, laughter. Not the taunting kind, not even the cruel kind. It was old, resigned, exhausted. Do you see now, mortal? The voice came from everywhere, the cracked ground, the blood-hazed sky, the echoes in his skull. This is the shape of existence. The fight is not the punishment, it is the purpose. Saitama didn't answer. Even your silence is defiance. You cannot help it. You are conflict given skin. You cannot stop, because stopping is surrender, and surrender is not in you. He closed his eyes. Maybe not, but this isn't living. It never was. The voice corns, or the warps, or something that had borrowed both, rumbled with the tired joy of inevitability. You have become the proof of our creed. You are the dream we did not know we were dreaming, a warrior with no hate, a weapon that destroys without feeling. You are purity. Then I'm broken, Saitama said softly, because I don't feel pure, I just feel empty. The arena laughed again, softer this time. Empty things make the loudest echoes. He walked for a long time, or maybe he simply stood, and the ground moved beneath him. Either way, he found himself in a different place, a field of red dust where skeletons of angels lay impaled on their own wings. He sat down among them. At first there was peace, then the dust began to whisper. Bite, bite, bite. He put his hands over his ears. It didn't help. The sound came from inside, from the pulse of the warp, from the memory of everything that had ever raised a weapon in fear. Saitama pressed his palms against the ground. The dust vibrated beneath his touch, eager to become an enemy again. He shook his head. Not today. But time here didn't care about days. He lost track of thought, of motion, of choice. Somewhere between the 1,000th and millionth battle, he stopped remembering why he fought at all. His fists moved by reflex, his eyes dulled. The warp, once screaming, grew quiet around him. Even daemons began to avoid his path, sensing that there was no glory left in dying to a man who did not notice them die. He wandered through empty storms, through oceans of coagulated blood, through forests of bone that sang hymns about nothing. When he spoke, his voice sounded small even to himself. Is this what it's like for you? He meant Khorne. He meant the Emperor. He meant everyone. In a far corner of the warp, something watched him, a sliver of intellect wrapped in deceit and curiosity. Tzientch, the architect of fate, perched upon the scaffolding of realities like a scholar reading a forbidden equation. The variable continues to persist, the changer murmured. No decay, no corruption, no purpose. His lesser servitors hissed in dissonant awe. Then perhaps the pattern can be rewritten, one dared to suggest. No, Tzientch said. The pattern has already broken itself. He is what happens when inevitability gets bored. And for the first time in the history of the Changer of Ways, there was something he did not wish to change. Back in the field of ash, Saitama felt the air tremble. Another storm was forming. He didn't rise. Not yet. He had learned that no matter what came, daemon, god, or cosmic tantrum, the outcome was the same. The only question that remained was why. He remembered the Emperor's words, strike to stop. He looked down at his hands. They were steady, unscarred, meaningless. He closed them into fists. Then maybe it's time to stop the fight itself. He rose. The storm arrived. The ground cracked, and from it came the echoes of every battle ever fought. Space Marines, Orcs, Eldar, Tyranids, men and machines, gods and mortals, all reduced to silhouettes of fury. They converged, forming a vortex of endless motion. The warp howled with delight, thinking it had found its perfect song. Saitama stepped into the center. He did not strike. He simply stood. The first impact came from all sides. Claws, blades, energy, psychic fire, everything hit him at once. The warp itself bent, feeding on the violence. But it couldn't find purchase. The blows landed, but they made no sound. The world dimmed. He opened his eyes. I'm not playing anymore. Something in the warp cracked. The colors began to die. The rivers turned gray. The air froze mid-scream. Even the gods felt it, that unbearable stillness where worship could not breathe. Nurgle's laughter faded into coughing silence. Tzientch's schemes stopped rearranging themselves. Slaanesh paused mid-song, sensing a note that wasn't supposed to exist. And Khorne, from his throne of skulls, clenched his fists around the absence of a sword. He's doing it again, the god whispered. He's stopping. For the first time in 10,000 years, the warp experienced stillness. It was not victory. It was disinterest. And for creatures born of motion, that was annihilation. Saitama stood alone, the universe holding its breath. He looked up at the colorless sky and exhaled. A faint echo came from somewhere beyond the red clouds, a whisper that wasn't a voice. "Strike to stop." He smiled, tired and small. "Guess I did." Then, slowly, reality began to remember itself. The air regained weight. The red bled back into existence, but softer now, less hungry. The warp's pulse returned, slower, uncertain. Saitama turned and began to walk. Each step left behind silence that refused to fade. He didn't know where he was going. Maybe nowhere. Maybe home. But as he moved, somewhere in the depths of the immaterium, a thought took root, a thought the gods could neither consume nor erase. If a man can end war by refusing to fight, what does that make of gods who exist only to scream? The warp shuddered, dreaming of peace for the first time since time began. And in that trembling dream, Saitama kept walking, his shadow long and patient across the blood-red sky. The moment after the stillness shattered, Saitama found himself somewhere that wasn't a place. No wind, no weight, no light, just memory pretending to be space. He stood upon a surface that wasn't solid, surrounded by constellations that moved like thoughts rather than stars. Every color was muted. Even light seemed hesitant, afraid to disturb the quiet. For the first time since arriving in this universe, Saitama felt something strange. Not fatigue, not pain, continuity. He was moving through something older than reality, a region that existed before the warp learned how to scream. Ahead, a single table, wooden, ordinary, the kind you'd find in an old ramen shop at the end of a rainy night. Steam rose from 2 bowls placed upon it, and across from him, seated with the stillness of inevitability, was a man. No armor, no throne, no divine fire. Just a tired figure in a dark robe, his face half-shadowed, his eyes gold like candles running out of wick. When he spoke, it wasn't command. It was conversation. "Sit, stranger." Saitama did. Didn't expect noodles in the afterlife. "This isn't the afterlife," the man said. "It's the space between remembering and forgetting." "Sounds like my fridge." The faintest flicker of a smile crossed the man's face, as if his mouth had forgotten how to do it and was relearning. "You stopped the fight," he said. "Do you understand what that means?" Saitama shrugged. "I got tired of punching. Figured silence was better." "Silence," the man echoed. "Yes. The gods are screaming less now. Even Khorne sits quietly upon his throne, unsure if he still exists. You've done something that the Imperium, the Chaos, and even I could not." "Yeah, but it's boring again." The man studied him for a long while. "Do you know what we become? We who kill too perfectly." Saitama blinked. "Bald? Empty." The word lingered like incense. Every empire, every god, every hero ends here, where victory and meaning cancel one another out. You've reached the border of purpose, and there is nothing beyond it except yourself. Saitama stared into his bowl. The noodles hadn't moved since he sat. They just waited. He picked up the chopsticks. "You talk like you've been here before." "I built this place," the man said softly. "Before I was emperor, I was dreamer. Before I was dreamer, I was man. And before that, perhaps nothing. Guess we have that in common." "Perhaps." They ate in silence for a while. The flavor was indescribable, but not because it was divine, because it was real. Salt, warmth, simplicity. The kind of thing the universe forgot how to make once it invented prayer. After a time, Saitama spoke again. "So, what now? I stopped your universe from punching itself. Feels like that should count for something." The man nodded. "It does. But consequences ripple. The warp depends on motion, on war, on desire, on fear. You've removed its fuel. Without the fight, it will fade. And with it, so will everything built upon it." "So you're saying I broke the battery?" "Yes." Saitama frowned. "Can't someone just build a better one? Something less insane?" The man looked at him carefully. "Maybe you can." A wind began to stir, not from outside, but from memory. Around them, images unfolded like reflections on water. The Emperor's wars, the rise of the Primarchs, the betrayal of Horus, the slow decay of an empire that mistook faith for oxygen. I once believed I could save mankind through control, the Emperor said. Through perfection. I was wrong. I built a cage so strong that even hope forgot the way out. He leaned forward, eyes dimming. You broke the cage by accident. That's what makes it beautiful. Saitama looked down at his bowl again. So, what? I'm supposed to fix humanity now? Not fix, remind. Of what? That they are allowed to stop fighting. Saitama leaned back, folding his arms. You really think they'll listen? They might not. But they'll remember the story, the one where a man fell from nowhere, met gods, and didn't bow. He paused. And sometimes, that's enough. The stars around them began to move faster. The table flickered, the noodles turning into constellations, the bowls dissolving into mist. The Emperor's voice softened. I will wake soon. My dream must end. When I do, the Imperium will roar again. It always does. But somewhere, in some corner of it, there will be silence. And that silence will bear your name. Saitama stood. Not really into fame. Then call it freedom. Freedom's fine, I guess. Good. He rose too, and for a moment, his golden eyes blazed bright not with power, but with gratitude. You've done what none of my sons ever could. What's that? Walk away. The light began to fade. The stars melted into dark blue. The Emperor's figure blurred into gold smoke, his voice lingering only as warmth in the air. Remember, Saitama, even gods dream of rest. Don't deny them yours. And then he was gone. Saitama stood alone in the void. For a long moment, he simply existed, the silence humming like a heartbeat around him. Then, slowly, he noticed something ahead, a faint speck of light, white and soft, not angry like the warp's glow but calm. He began to walk toward it. With each step, the ground changed. The blood-red fog became blue. The sky began to remember stars again. The universe, tentative and childlike, tried rebuilding itself around the absence of war. At the edge of it all stood the Sister of Silence. Her armor was cracked, her eyes tired, but she was smiling, a small, unassuming thing, like someone who'd finally found proof that prayer could be quiet. Saitama blinked. You again? She nodded. You broke the noise. Yeah, sorry if that messed things up. It didn't, she said. It healed things that never thought they could be healed. She stepped closer. They'll sing about this, you know, not the battles, the ending. Saitama looked away, embarrassed. Make sure they don't get my face wrong. Behind them, the stars began to bloom again. Entire constellations rebuilt themselves, but slower this time, gentler, as though they'd learned humility. The warp's light softened to a shimmer instead of a scream. The sister turned toward him. You could stay. Saitama looked at the horizon where the galaxy was being rewritten in silence. Maybe I will. For a while. She tilted her head. Why? He smiled faintly. Someone's got to make sure they don't start another fight. She almost laughed. Almost. Then she reached out, touching his shoulder, the smallest gesture of faith in a universe that had forgotten how to trust anything that didn't bleed. Then the galaxy will rest a little longer. Saitama nodded. Let's hope so. They stood together at the edge of creation, watching the first sunrise the warp had ever seen. Far above, unseen and unspoken, the Emperor dreamed one last dream of a man who refused to play by divine rules. And in that dream, humanity finally remembered what peace sounded like. It sounded like nothing at all. The first sound was wind. Not the warp's howling void wind that carried the screams of daemons, but real wind, cold, clear, and lonely. It whispered through mountains of ice and across a dead city where banners no longer meant anything. Saitama blinked awake beneath a grey dawn. He was lying on stone, cracked, familiar, imperial. The stars above him were real again, sharp and small and silent. The warp was gone. He sat up slowly, flexing his hands. They felt heavier, not weak, just real. The air had weight, time had shape, and for the first time since he'd fallen through that red storm, gravity felt like a conversation rather than a leash. He looked around. Ruins stretched to the horizon. The fortress monastery of Cadentis VIII was broken, walls crumbled, towers reduced to bones of metal and marble. But there was no fire, no chanting, no machinery, only wind, and a faint echo of birds learning to sing again. He smiled. Guess I'm back. The Sister of Silence was there, waiting at the edge of the courtyard. Her armor was battered, her robes torn by centuries that had passed without her noticing. She stood perfectly still, like a statue that had remembered its purpose. Saitama approached. Hey, how long was I out? She tilted her head, listening to something only she could hear. Time broke while you were gone. It's rebuilding. Cool. Hope it doesn't charge overtime. A faint expression, maybe amusement, maybe disbelief, crossed her face. You left for an instant and for an eternity. To the Imperium, you were myth. To the warp, heresy. He looked out over the world. Looks peaceful now. For now, she said. They will rebuild. They always do. He sighed. Yeah, people can't resist making noise. True, she said softly. But now they know silence can exist. That changes everything. They began walking through the ruins together. The city had been half swallowed by nature roots growing through steel, moss painting the skeletons of titans that had once marched in the Emperor's name. Servitors wandered like lost souls, their programming still murmuring fragments of hymns. A single data seraph fluttered above, its wings glitching in slow motion. Saitama stopped beside a cracked statue of the Emperor. The head was gone, the hands broken. Only the base remained, carved with the words, "In his silence, we endure." He brushed the dust off the inscription. He wasn't wrong. The sister nodded. He dreamed of order. You gave him stillness. That's close enough. He looked at her. So, what happens to you now? No more screaming gods, no more psychic storms. Guess you don't have much to silence. Her eyes softened. Perhaps not. But silence isn't just the absence of noise. It's a promise that something better might follow. They reached the edge of the ruins, where the plains began endless fields of glass and grass reborn in the same breath. A faint blue light shimmered across the horizon, where the sky touched the scars of the planet. Saitama sat down on a broken stone, stretching his legs. You think people will ever stop fighting? No, she said, but maybe they'll stop worshipping the fight. He nodded. That's a start. For a long while, neither spoke. The wind carried only the sound of a world trying to remember its own rhythm, the sound of leaves moving against each other, of water learning how to flow again. It was the kind of peace that didn't need witnesses. Eventually, she broke the silence. You could leave, you know. Leave? The stars are quiet again. The immaterium is still healing. The way home, whatever world you came from, might exist again now. He frowned, looking at his hands. I don't even know if it's there anymore, or if it was ever real. She studied him. Then make it real. He chuckled softly. You sound like the old man. I was trained by those who served him, she said. We learned to speak without words, but not to hope. You changed that. He stood, looking at the horizon again. If I go, what happens to you? She shrugged lightly. I'll keep the silence. Someone has to. He smiled. You're good at it. They walked until they reached a cliff overlooking the sea, a grey, mirror-like expanse stretching forever. For a moment, Saitama thought he saw something move beneath the surface. Massive, ancient, and patient. Life returning to a world that had forgotten how to breathe. He crouched and picked up a stone. It was smooth, heavy, perfectly ordinary. He tossed it out over the water. It skipped once, twice, then disappeared beneath the waves. See, he said, still works. The Sister of Silence looked at him, her expression unreadable. Everything still works, just differently. He nodded. Maybe that's enough. Night fell slowly, as if unsure it was allowed to. Above them, the stars glowed faintly gold, not with the fury of the Astronomicon, but with the calm of natural light. There was no psychic beacon anymore. The Emperor's presence was gone from the sky, but not from memory. Somewhere, deep inside the galaxy, the throne still existed, empty, cracked, silent. But for the first time in 10,000 years, it was at rest. And that, somehow, was the truest kind of divinity the Imperium had ever known. Saitama stood, brushing the dust from his cloak. Well, I guess this is where we part ways. She inclined her head slightly. "You're going?" He nodded. "Yeah, maybe I'll find another world that needs less noise." "Will you come back?" He smiled faintly. "If people start yelling again, sure." The Sister of Silence didn't reply, but her eyes shone with something that might have been gratitude, or maybe faith, though neither of them would have called it that. He turned to leave. At the edge of the cliffs, reality shimmered thin, uncertain. Beyond it lay countless stars, each one a story waiting to make the same mistake again. Saitama looked back once. The sister stood alone in the fading light, her figure still and certain, her silence vast enough to hold the whole galaxy. "Take care, quiet lady." She gave the smallest nod. "And you, constant man." Then, with a sound like a breath being released after an eternity, he stepped forward and was gone. The sister watched the air settle. The wind carried no trace of him, only a faint echo, not sound, not thought, but something gentler, like the memory of laughter left behind in stone. She turned back toward the ruins. The silence followed. Far above, in the cold void, the Emperor's dream flickered one last time. He saw the man in yellow walking across stars, leaving footprints where light refused to shine. And in that dream, he whispered not a command, not a prophecy, just a simple truth. Peace does not roar, it breathes. And the galaxy, for one impossible moment, remembered how to breathe. Years passed, or centuries. Time, after so much breaking, had forgotten how to count itself properly, but life remembered. Across the galaxy once called the Imperium of Man, stars burned a little softer. Planets once enslaved to prayer began to speak in simpler tongues again, languages without divine verbs, sentences that ended in laughter instead of decrees. The ecclesiarchy still existed, though smaller now, humbler. Its cathedrals were places of quiet, not command. Candles were lit not to beg for salvation, but to thank the silence that had given them back their breath. They called it the Quiet Age. In the archives of the Adeptus Terra, those few left who still believed in recording anything, they had a new creed etched into the marble halls. The Emperor sleeps, but humanity dreams. Where there had once been sermons of conquest, there were poems. Where there had once been orders to cleanse, there were songs sung by children who did not yet know the word heresy. And above it all, the Astronomicon, once the Emperor's blinding lighthouse, now flickered as a soft, wandering pulse. It no longer guided fleets, it marked the heartbeat of peace. On Cadentis 8, the world that had been the crucible of gods, spring returned for the first time in 10 millennia. Grass grew through the cracks of the old fortress. Birds nested in the hollows of statues that once represented wrath. The rivers ran clear again, no longer thick with the residue of faith and fear. The Sister of Silence still walked its ruins. Her steps were slow but certain, her armor weathered but polished. She was no longer the weapon she had been, no longer the absence that terrified psychers and priests alike. She had become something gentler, a caretaker of stillness. Pilgrims came sometimes, from far systems. They brought no relics, only questions. She would listen, then say nothing, and somehow that was enough. One day, under a sky of unbroken blue, a child approached her. He was small, ragged, holding a scrap of parchment. On it, a drawing, a bald man in a yellow suit punching a monster into dust. The sister crouched, her silence soft as snow. "Who told you that story?" she signed. The boy grinned. "Everyone knows it. The man who stopped the gods. The one who said fighting's boring." She tilted her head. "Do they remember his name?" He thought for a long moment, then shrugged. "No, just that," he smiled. She smiled back. "That's enough." The boy ran off, his laughter echoing through the empty cathedral. For the first time in her long, disciplined life, she let herself laugh too soundless, but real. Elsewhere, beyond the edges of what was once imperial space, the Mechanicus had changed. The tech priests, deprived of the machine god's wrathful whispers, began to hear something else, the hum of understanding. Their prayers became equations again. Their equations became art. For the first time, they built without fear. One among them, an ancient magos named Luthrix, discovered an old transmission buried deep within the data crypts of Mars. It was corrupted, fragmented, barely legible, but one phrase survived, repeated endlessly like a heartbeat. Strike to stop. The Magos, unable to interpret its origin, adopted it as a design principle. And thus, for the first time in history, machines were built not for war but for ending war. Across distant sectors, space marines still existed. Their gene lines endured, their armor gleamed, but their eyes had changed. They no longer crusaded, they guarded. The chapter masters met not in councils of strategy but of stewardship. The angels penitent, once the Crimson Warriors who had followed the Inquisitor into Cadentis 8, had renamed themselves Custodies of the Pause. They bore no banners, their armor was plain. When asked whom they served, they would answer, "We serve the moment between two breaths." And what of the Inquisition? It did not vanish, it never could. Some truths were too stubborn to die, but it softened. The Ordo still watched, still whispered, still doubted. Yet even among them, the idea of mercy had taken root like a forbidden flower. There was talk, in secret chambers, of the paradox doctrine, a belief that the Emperor himself had permitted imperfection to save the species from perfection's cruelty. None dared publish it. All feared it, but none denied that since Cadentis fell silent, fewer heretics burned. And in the silent halls beneath Terra, where the golden throne sat empty and still, a single flower grew through the cracks of the marble floor. No one knew how it got there. It wasn't golden. It wasn't sacred. It was just alive. Every few decades, the Sister of Silence would climb the western cliffs of Cadentis the 8. She would stand where the sea met the sky, and she would look upward. And sometimes, only sometimes, she would see it. A flash of yellow, a figure leaping from star to star, a comet shaped like a man moving across constellations too slowly to notice. No warp signature, no power trace, just motion. She never told anyone. She would simply smile, bow her head, and whisper into the wind. Peace still breathes. Legends grew around the universe-wide silence that followed his departure. Some claimed the man in yellow became a god of balance, sitting quietly between chaos and the materium. Others said he found another universe entirely, one less tragic, and finally took that nap he'd been chasing since the beginning of time. And a few whispered that he still walked unseen, showing up wherever violence grew too loud, one punch, one sigh, one reminder at a time. No one knew the truth. But they all agreed on one thing. Every time the galaxy got too noisy, stars seemed to dim for a second, as if clearing their throats in embarrassment. One night, deep in the void, aboard a quiet Mechanicus vessel studying ancient transmissions, a tech adept monitoring long-range frequencies heard something strange. Not static, not signal. A voice, calm, casual, bored. "Man, you guys really don't learn, huh?" Then silence again. The adept wrote in his log, "Possible anomaly, unidentified signal, no energy reading, no source, just peace." He stared at the log for a long while before adding a final line. "I think it smiled." Far, far away, beyond the edge of the galaxy, Saitama sat on an asteroid watching two suns rise over a nebula. He slurped instant ramen out of a plastic cup, the same way he always had. "Pretty view," he said to no one. The universe didn't answer. It didn't need to. For once, silence was enough. He finished the ramen, crumpled the cup, and tossed it into the void. It drifted away, turning slowly, catching starlight as it went. "Guess I'll see what's next," he murmured. And with a single step, he was gone, just another quiet ripple moving through creation, unseen, but somehow felt by everyone who ever wished the world would stop screaming for just one day. In the age that followed, the galaxy called itself by a new name. The Quiet Empire. Not ruled by gods, not bound by fear, just breathing. There are sounds that the universe should never remember. And yet, even silence has an aftertaste. Long after the Quiet Empire had begun to breathe, somewhere beyond the map of stars past the galactic rim, where human ships no longer sailed, and the light of suns turned thin and grey, something stirred. It wasn't alive, not anymore. It wasn't dead either. It was memory trying to remember itself. The last fragment of the warp existed here, a dim ocean beneath reality's crust, drained of rage, stripped of color, but still aware. It pulsed faintly, like an old wound that hadn't decided whether to heal or reopen. Once, it had been infinite, a screaming chaos where the emotions of all living beings fed gods and monsters alike. Now, it was only a whisper. No more storms, no more demons, no more desire. Just a question, floating through the dark. What happens to a god when no one believes in war anymore? The answer came as a ripple. From that ripple, faint shapes began to rise, flickers of what had been. Khorne's throne stood cracked, his rivers of blood congealed into rust. His helm lay sideways, collecting dust that looked suspiciously like peace. The sound of his heartbeat, once the metronome of slaughter, was fading, stretched thin across eternity. And yet, something still beat within the emptiness. Something patient, something human. It was a dream. Not of gods, not of warriors, of a man. Bold, plain, unimpressed. The warp remembered him, even though it tried not to. The man who had silenced it. The one who had refused to play. In the cold vacuum of unbeing, the memory of Saitama lingered like a burn mark. Not pain, not fear, but proof that stillness could exist inside infinite motion. And for the warp, that was unbearable. The darkness began to shift. Not violently, not like the old storms, but softly, curiously. A single red spark ignited, a dying thought of anger flickering back to life. He left. He left us without purpose. The spark drifted across the void, seeking other remnants. It found them whispers of Slanesh's desire, threads of Tsiench's curiosity, spores of Nurgle's sorrow. They were faint, broken things, mere ghosts of ideas, but together they remembered a habit. They remembered wanting. The red spark spoke again. We cannot die if we are remembered. And so, in that silence, something listened. On a distant world, deep in the heart of the quiet empire, a soldier dreamed. He was young, stationed on the edge of a newly terraformed moon. He had never seen a daemon, never heard of chaos except in bedtime warnings. His uniform bore no sigil of the Aquila, only a simple emblem, a circle, open at one side. In his dream, he stood in an empty field of red dust. He felt the wind on his face and the weight of a blade in his hand. A voice whispered, "Fight." He frowned in his sleep, his hand clenched, his heart raced. When he awoke, his pulse was quick, his breath sharp, the instincts of a species that had never truly forgotten its wars. And somewhere in the void, the spark brightened. The gods of chaos had always been reflections, the mirrors of what mortals feared most in themselves. The quiet empire had silenced them, but silence could not erase reflection. It could only delay it. For every man who rested, one still dreamed of strength. For every world that built, another feared losing what it had built. For every peace hard won, there was someone wondering how long it would last. And in those thoughts, small, almost innocent, the warp began to breathe again. But this time, it was different. No roaring, no madness. The gods did not return as tyrants, they returned as echoes. Nurgle was no longer pestilence, but patience, the will to endure decay without despair. Slanesh was not indulgence, but art, the longing to create what words could not express. Tsiench became not deceit, but curiosity, the spark that drives change without fear. And Khorne became the drumbeat of protection, the strength to fight, not to destroy, but to defend. They were smaller now, humble. They existed not to rule mortals, but to remind them that even peace requires courage. They were not gods anymore. They were emotions again. The warp sighed, at last, content to be what it was always meant to be, not chaos, not damnation, but the sea of the soul. Far away, beyond stars and stories, Saitama stood watching. He floated above a nebula shaped like a blooming flower, the last gift of a dying star to the universe. The light brushed against his face gently, as if thanking him for the quiet. He yawned. So, it's starting again, huh? The cosmos did not answer, but the nebula seemed to shimmer, almost apologetically. Yeah, he said, smiling faintly. That's fine, long as they're not killing each other over haircuts again. He turned, adjusting his torn cape. Guess I'll check in once in a while, keep 'em honest. Then, after a moment's pause, maybe I'll finally find someone who can give me a real challenge." He chuckled softly, a small, ordinary sound that somehow carried across light years. In the throne room that wasn't, the Emperor stirred one final time. His golden armor, long since darkened, glimmered faintly under the starlight that seeped through the cracks of Terra's roofless halls. He did not rise. He didn't need to. He only whispered not to the galaxy, not to the gods, but to the one figure who had never asked to be remembered. "You were never my weapon, Saitama. You were my cure." And the dream ended. On Cadentis 8, the Sister of Silence stood once more at the sea cliffs. The night was deep, the stars unblinking. She could feel it, the faint hum returning to the air, not the old chaos, but life. She smiled. "Peace breathes," she said, "and it dreams." A wave crashed below, gentle and white. Far in the sky, a streak of yellow light moved slowly toward another world. And somewhere, in a place too distant to have a name, the warp itself exhaled for the first time in eternity. The sound it made was soft, uncertain, and beautiful. Not a scream, not a roar, just the faint, rhythmic pulse of a universe that had learned finally that not every echo needs to become a shout. The legend of the one punch faded into myth. The myth became silence, and the silence became balance. The galaxy kept spinning, not in rage, not in faith, just breathing. He walked through galaxies that no longer needed heroes. Worlds spun in patient silence, their skies soft and wide, their seas gentle again. The stars no longer howled prayers to forgotten gods, they simply burned steady, content, alive. And, through those stars, a lone figure moved. He didn't fly, he didn't teleport. He simply walked, each step a ripple through the vacuum, each stride bridging constellations. He left no trail, no legend carved in fire, only quiet, only balance. Where he went, storms gentled. Where he lingered, weapons rusted. Where he rested, men remembered how to talk instead of shout. No one knew his name anymore, they didn't need to. He was not the Emperor's angel, nor Chaos's curse. He was the pause after thunder. He was the man who walked out of war. Once, on a small frontier world of the Quiet Empire, a settlement of farmers and tinkers and children who had never heard of the Horus heresy, a meteor fell. It didn't burn, it shimmered. The villagers ran to where it landed, fearing destruction, hoping for miracles. What they found instead was a man in a yellow suit, sitting calmly in the crater, dusting his gloves. He looked up, a little surprised. "Oh, guess I overshot." They asked his name, but he only smiled, standing as though gravity was an old friend he'd stopped visiting. He spent a few weeks there, helping them rebuild their irrigation pumps, teaching children how to catch fish without nets, fixing roofs before storms. They offered him a place at their council. He declined politely. "Too much paperwork," he said. When the next dawn came, he was gone. Only a note remained, scratched into metal. "Keep it quiet out there." Centuries passed. The villagers forgot his face, but not the feeling he left behind. They built a shrine not of stone or gold, but of silence. A circular garden of smooth white rock, where no prayers were spoken, no banners flown. Only the wind moved there, whispering stories it barely understood. They called it the place where noise dies. And travelers came. Pilgrims, soldiers, scholars. Each stood there for a while, and each left lighter, as if some burden they didn't know they carried had been lifted. None ever saw the man again. But every now and then, the wind would stir the dust into a brief, round shape, bold, smiling, gone before it could be named. Across the galaxy, the Sister of Silence aged. Her hair silvered, her armor retired. She lived now as a teacher, in a monastery that wasn't really a monastery, a refuge for orphans of forgotten wars. She taught them not just to read or fight, but to listen. Sometimes, when night fell, she would step outside and look at the stars. One evening, she found a young student sitting on the steps, staring up at the sky. "Mother," the child said softly, "is it true? The story about the man who could stop gods?" The sister smiled, sitting beside her, It's true enough. Do you think he's still out there? The sister looked at the horizon, where the last light of the sun kissed the sea. I think he walks wherever he's needed. Maybe not as a man, maybe not even as himself anymore. But yes. The girl frowned. Will he come back? The sister hesitated, then nodded. When we start shouting again. The girl thought about that. Then I'll try to keep quiet. The sister smiled. That's all he ever wanted. Elsewhere at the center of what had once been the Imperium's heart, the golden throne still stood. It was empty. Dust gathered on its vast frame. The machinery around it had long gone silent, its cables dry, its conduits cold. And yet, sometimes, when the solar winds struck terror just right, the throne hummed a low, contented sound, like a deep sigh. To some, it was a relic. To others, proof that the Emperor still dreamed. To a few, it was a reminder that divinity doesn't vanish when forgotten, it just rests when it's no longer needed. In time, human explorers left the Milky Way entirely. They reached into neighboring galaxies, carrying with them nothing of their old gods, only curiosity and humility. Their ships bore a new emblem, a circle open at one side, painted in quiet yellow. Its meaning was lost to history, though some said it was the mark of a wanderer who once saved existence by refusing to fight. A symbol of peace without promise. Far beyond them all, at the rim of reality itself, a figure sat upon a fragment of star. He watched universes being born, some bright, some brief, some doomed, some kind. He watched their stories unfold, quietly, as one might watch clouds drift. He had seen empires rise and fall, gods burn and fade, chaos scream and whisper. He had learned that peace was not a state, but a rhythm, one that required both sound and silence to exist. And he had learned to let it play without trying to conduct. The nebulae shifted gently in his reflection. A soft breeze that wasn't air passed across his face. Somewhere nearby, a dying sun flickered its last. He reached out a hand and caught one of its last rays between his fingers. It warmed his palm like the memory of light. "Good job," he murmured. "You made it further than most." He let the ray go, and it drifted off, a newborn star carried away by the current. He smiled, stood, and brushed the dust from his suit. "Well," he said to himself, "back to walking." And with a step so simple it made the cosmos seem smaller, he vanished, leaving behind not an explosion, not an echo, but a silence deep enough to hold a universe. The final verse. Once there was war, and it devoured everything. Then came a man who devoured war with indifference. He was neither savior nor saint. He was simply bored of screams. And so the gods fell quiet, and the stars remembered how to breathe. They say he still walks, somewhere between galaxies. Not to save them, not to rule them, just to keep them from shouting too loud.